All right, folks. So in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about the best radios for beginner amateur radio operators or beginner hams. We're going to take a look at 3 radios in particular that I feel are good or well suited for new hams. So when we start talking about this issue, I think the first thing that comes up is, what is the problem? Why do people ask what's a good radio for a ham? And ham radio can be confusing for beginners. There's a lot of different things that you can do. There's a lot of equipment out there, various prices, and that is all intimidating to somebody who is entering in the hobby. They really feel a sense of uncertainty when they don't have the expertise that they will develop over time. The other thing is that everybody's got an opinion, including myself, and I'm putting it in this video right here for everybody to watch. But one of the things I think that we need to be mindful of is that not all advice is good advice. A lot of people will give advice based off of their paradigm or their experience or their way of thinking. They also give their advice as if they were that person, not so much putting themselves in that person's shoes. And I think that's something that we need to consider here. Not every ham is the same. And a lot of times people will turn to vendors. But a lot of times vendors can be misleading, especially when you're looking at buying antennas. And I've got a couple of videos on antennas for beginners you might want to check out. But they'll use technical jargon, complicated graphs, or downright misinformation to say that something performs better than another. And what you have to realize is that vendors are there to make money, and they only make money by selling you products. And if they sell you one product, they're going to move on and want to sell you the second product. And I'm not really sure that that is the best thing. If I was to be able to sell you the one radio that's all you're ever going to need, putting myself out of business there, right? So when vendors give advice on these things, take it with a grain of salt. The other problem is budget. Ham radio equipment can be expensive. Amateur radio in itself is expensive. When you look to buy a radio, even if you're looking at a $50 HT, then you got to buy antenna upgrade in many cases, programming cable. You might buy programming software or use something free like Chirp, where you can program your radio. Coaxial cable, all these things start to add up, and it adds up fast. So budget can also be a limiting factor. So that said, let's talk about the 3 different types of radios. All right, so the question that people ask is, what do I need? That's what the hams ask. And what I think here is that 3 radios are going to cover most of your needs. And so we're going to categorize the 3 different radios or types of radios in this way. We're going to talk about handhelds, and here's just an example of a handheld radio. It's sometimes called a handy-talkie, and I don't really like that name. It sounds kind of goofy. I think I'd rather call it a walkie-talkie, but I guess a walkie-talkie is a non-ham radio. I don't know why they call them handy-talkies. But for short, a lot of people will call them an HT. I tend to call them a handheld because I think that's a little bit more descriptive, especially to somebody who's not used to the amateur radio vernacular. We're going to talk a little bit about mobile radios or base station radios. So a lot of hams, including myself, will buy a mobile radio and set that up in a permanent, semi-permanent location like a ham shack with a power supply or a battery and then maybe an antenna outside the window. And that can be quite an exciting experience for amateur radio operators. The last thing we're going to talk about is an HF or high frequency radio. Now we call them high frequency, but they're on the lower end of the amateur radio spectrum. Because you have high frequency, then you have very high frequency, ultra high frequency, super high frequency. So the name, even in and of itself, high frequency, can be a little bit confusing. But we're going to take a look at a beginner HF radio. So when we talk about handhelds, people say, well, why would I want a handheld? Why would I need a handheld? And a lot of hams actually start out with their first radio being a handheld ham radio. Reason being, they're small and portable. They can fit inside a backpack, a glove box, clip to your belt, clip to your backpack strap. Very lightweight, and it's everything that you need contained within one unit. You have your antenna, your battery, your power supply, and your radio all in something you can hold in your hand. It's really handy, and they're a lot of fun. They're a lot of fun to play around with. I've got a lot of handhelds. I've done lots of videos you can check out on different handhelds, but they are a pretty exciting way to get into amateur radio. Now, most of these are dual band radios. And we talk about a dual band radio, that means it operates on 2 different segments of spectrum that are available for amateur radio users. Typically what you'll see is the 2 meter band. It's 144 megahertz, give or take. and then the 70 centimeter band, which is 440 megahertz, give or take. Now you'll see some that are marked as tri-band radios, and they'll include the 1.25 meter band, or 220 megahertz. And sometimes you'll see them that do 6 meters, but those are getting further and further, few and far between, where the amateur radio companies just aren't making money selling those radios. And as a result, you see a supply and demand problem. And as a result of that, you see them less frequently on the market. And a lot of times when you see some of these less expensive handheld radios that are tri-banders, they don't perform the way that they should, and it can be problematic. So if you want to find a good tri-band radio, I think Yaesu makes some, and Waxon makes some, or Woshun or Oshun, I'm not 100% sure how you say it, would be probably where I would look at there. But for a beginner, in your area, you probably have 2 meter and 70 centimeter repeaters, or just a 2 meter or a 70 centimeter repeater. And that's probably the way that you should go. Also with HTs, there's a lot of HTs on the market today that have digital modes. And that's becoming more and more popular. Digital modes allow you to modulate your analog signal into a digital set of tones that you can transmit further, because it requires less spectrum than an audio signal. And that gives us more bandwidth, and kind of acts in a way as bandwidth preservation. But these digital radios can be a little bit more expensive, a little bit more difficult to configure, and require a little bit more technical acumen. Also, there's different specifications. DMR is a little bit more of an open standard, so you see a lot of radio manufacturers putting out digital mobile transceivers, DMR radios, that you can use with other manufacturers. And then you have some proprietary technologies like Yaesu's System Fusion, which is a fantastic digital mode, but it's only compatible with other Yaesu radios unless you are doing a level of conversion through something like a mobile hotspot. That's beyond the scope of this video. And then you have ICOM's D-Star. There's other things out there, but those are the more popular digital modes. When you talk about handhelds, there's a lot of things that you can buy for these things, different accessories. So there's antenna upgrades galore, and you can get pretty decent antennas for your HT for around 15, 25, 35 bucks, somewhere right around there. The other one is that you can buy extended battery packs, or you can buy extra battery packs, hand microphones, you can buy belt pouches and things to store your HT in. So there's a lot of accessories on the market for these things, and it makes them like a fashion statement almost. The other thing is that we use these handhelds primarily for local communications with your buddy down the road, or repeater communications. And with a decent repeater, you can get some pretty good coverage. And so what we'll see is that amateur radio clubs will typically have their own club repeater. And a lot of people will use HTs when they're at their house, or mobile radio, to talk to their buddies from the club when they're driving around. The other one is that handhelds are pretty budget friendly. You can get a pretty good handheld radio for about 25 to 50 to 150 bucks. You don't have to spend a whole lot of money. It just depends on what you want and what you're looking for. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a handheld HT radio that I recommend, but I'm going to turn myself off so you get to look at the radio instead of my face. And for the handheld, what I really recommend folks get is this Baofeng. It is a GT5R, and it's made and sold by Radio Oddity. And the reason that I recommend this radio are a couple things. One, you can get it for about $25, and that is an excellent price to get a HT radio that you can use. Now, you might say, Abe, well, why would I want to buy this one over another Baofeng that I can get for $17 off of eBay or Wish or whatever? And we'll talk about that later. And also, folks will say, well, I saw that you can get a different radio for $50 that has USB-C charging and Bluetooth programming. And there's reasons we would probably stay away from most of them as well. This radio is programmable by Chirp, and that is a huge plus. Chirp is free software. You do need a programming cable in order to program your radio. But by using Chirp, you can bulk import radio configurations from your buddy, from your club, or you can even download proximity searches off of Repeater Book that would allow you to program all of the repeaters in your area, or to an area that you travel to in one fell swoop. I would not buy a radio that you couldn't program with Chirp unless there was a compelling reason for it. The other one is that this radio is spectrally clean, and that means it doesn't produce spurious emissions or harmonics like some other radios do. When a radio produces these things, it makes it illegal for use on the amateur radio bands and causes interference all over the place, and is generally not a cool thing to be doing. And so that's why I recommend this $25 Baofeng over the myriad of other Baofengs that are out there, because it is spectrally clean. Also, I test a lot of radios on my channel. You can check out different videos. And there are tons of manufacturers putting out these newer radios that have things that hams have been asking for, like USB-C charging or Bluetooth programming or AM receive. And they are plagued with problems around spectral purity. And I just wouldn't recommend them for those reasons. The GT5R is a dual band radio, so it does give you 2 meters and 70 centimeters. And it comes in a popular form factor. I'd hazard to guess that the UV5R, which is the radio this is based on, is the most popular selling radio in the world. I know many, many people who have many of them. And the batteries are all interchangeable. The charging cradles are interchangeable. The antennas are interchangeable. Pocket clips, lanyards, just all of the different accessories that you could get for the UV5R. And there's a lot. You can use with this radio. And because of that, I think this makes it a really strong contender. It can put out up to 5 watts, which is fantastic for repeater work in your area. Oop, it looks like I had accessories down here, even though I talked about that under popular form factor. Some of the cons, people say that this radio is difficult to program. It's the first radio that I got, and it's the first radio that I was used to, so I learned how to program it. So that is something that's overcomeable, if that's a word, and achievable. But it is a little bit more cumbersome to program than some of the more expensive radios. But I think that you can learn to get through that. And what I did is I used Chirp to program my radio, and then I used the front end interface to modify the programming if necessary when I was away from a PC. The other one is that you see this on almost all of the cheaper entry-level radios, is that they suffer from front-end overload. And that has to do with the front-end conversion that this radio does when it picks up a signal. The way that it works technically, and it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, is that adjacent signals or strong signals in your area can cause the radio to hear them, and it creates a mixing problem in the radio, and then basically desensitizes the reception of your radio. But if you're sitting in your basement, your attic, your crawl space, wherever it is that you like to hang out and play amateur radio, and you're by yourself, you're probably fine. The other one is, I think this has 199 memories, which is a little bit limited in today's world, so that can be a little bit of a problem. I've known people who are like, I programmed every frequency from railroad to MERS to marine to GMRS, and then they run out of space. What I would do, given their $25, if you need one for all those different things, then maybe just buy more than one. The other one is people buy these for scanners, or they like to scan through frequencies, and they are slow when scanning. And I would consider that a con. But all in all, if I needed a radio and I didn't have a lot of money, and maybe I was recommending something about starting out, what they should get, this would be the HT that I would recommend. All right, and I'm back. And now we're talking a little bit about mobile radios. And these are the smaller radios that you would see mounted in a vehicle, for example. But as I mentioned, lots of people buy these and they mount them in their amateur radio space, their personal man space. We call that a ham shack. And these mobile radios are small and portable. Some of them are so small, people mount them inside of ammo cans or toolboxes, and they call it a go box. And they'll put an antenna in there, and they'll put a power supply, maybe even a solar panel to charge their power supply, like a battery. And they work out really well for that. They have a higher output, and so typically what you'll see on some of the less expensive ones, or some of the Chinese brands, are around 25 watts, which is 5 times higher than your HT, and that does make a difference. Now, you're not going to talk across country, you're not going to talk in multiple states, but you're going to get a cleaner, better, stronger signal into your repeater or to your buddies that you're talking to on Simplex. Generally, they have a larger screen. Controls are a little bit easier to read because of that. The controls are a little bit easier because you typically have a full keypad on the microphone, and then you have additional programmable buttons on the front of the radio, and it makes it a little bit easier to use. We mentioned you can mount these in a vehicle or a shack, and most of them are dual band, 2 meters and 70 centimeters. Again, just like the HTs, you'll see some that are tri-band, and some of them will be analog versus digital. But for an entry-level price point, you're not going to find a digital one. I think I put in here local and repeater comms, and they can be budget friendly. You can get a decent mobile radio, starter radio, for about $125. So the radio that I typically would recommend for somebody looking to buy an entry-level mobile radio is the Retevis RT95. And I've owned this radio as well as the last one that I spoke about. And I do like this radio. You can pick it up for about $105. It is chirp programmable, which we already talked about being a huge deal. And it's also spectrally clean, which is a nice thing because not a lot of these radios are. It's a very popular radio, and I put lots of support, maybe not so much from the vendor, but from the community. I know a lot of hams who have this radio, many, and it's also sold under different brands. I think it's an Anytone made radio that's sold by Retevis, and I think there's some other companies out there that put their logo or label on this radio. But because of that, you're liable to run into other folks that have them and be able to talk about different things that they have done or different problems or challenges they have overcome with theirs. And it's small. You can take a look at the hand mic there, which is about the size of a hand mic, and you can see the radio compared to that. So being small like that makes it very easy to put into things like a Go Box, put into a backpack if you want to just go backpack portable, or mount into your vehicle without your wife getting upset at you because it doesn't take up a lot of real estate. Some of the cons are the interface. It is a little bit difficult to program from the front panel at first until you learn how to do that. But again, we use Chirp to program these. Limited memories off the top of my head. I don't remember how many memories it has in it, but it doesn't have as much as some of the more expensive ones. And scan time. If you use this to scan, it does take a little bit of time. But a nice 25 watt dual band radio for $105 that's programmable by Chirp, that's pretty hard to beat. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about HF radios. And HF radios can be used portable or as a base station. Some of the base station ones get to be big monster things they call boat anchors, and some of the portable ones can be little teeny tiny things that you have trouble seeing. And you make some concessions either way, depending upon what you buy. When we talk about HF, most of these radios typically will cover the amateur radio bands from 160 meters, which require giant monster antennas, all the way up to 6 meters, even though 6 meters is technically VHF, very high frequency, not HF. A lot of times the manufacturers will throw that in. The radio that we're recommending, I believe, only goes to 10 meters. It does not cover the 6 meter band. Now, they typically are multi-mode. When we talk about multi-mode, the radios that we talked about previously work on FM modulation or send an FM frequency. These radios will typically do FM, AM for amplitude modulation, single sideband, upper or lower, depending upon the frequencies that you're on. And they'll even have settings for digital modes. And that's something that you may want to consider or get into. A lot of folks get into HF to specifically do digital modes. Also, they all support connecting a key for CW, like a paddle or one of those little buttons you push and makes the dots and the dits. HF radios are more expensive. That's just a fact of life. They're going to cost you more money than the UHF, VHF radios that we talked about earlier. And with these radios, you can do global communications. You can talk all over the world, which is an exciting thing and the thing that draws hams in. And it's one of the reasons that people get into amateur radio. And they can have a lot of features that can be confusing. All right, and the radio that I recommend for beginners is the Zygo G90. I had one of these. I used it for a couple of years, and I ended up trading it to a buddy of mine. He wanted to buy one and put it into a Go Box. The pros are it's about $425, give or take. You can buy this direct from Radio Oddity. That's probably what I would do. There's other manufacturers that sell them, but Radio Oddity does a pretty good job with support and bundling this with other accessories should you choose to buy there. It has a waterfall display, which is becoming more and more commonplace on radios today, but there are still a lot of radios out there that don't have this waterfall display, which makes identifying and tuning a signal much easier than if you didn't have it. Now, the screen on this radio is relatively small, so you need good eyes or a magnifying glass. It has a fantastic ATU, that's an antenna tuner. So when we get into HF, we start to require larger and larger antennas that can take up a lot of space. And sometimes you want to use these antennas on large bands of spectrum, large spectrums of frequencies, and they become out of tune or non-resident on some of these frequencies, especially if you're looking at multi-banded antennas, maybe an antenna you can use on 10, 20, 40 meters, for example. Antenna tuners can cost you anywhere from $100 to $1,000 or even more, depending upon what features you want, the power output levels that you need, and so forth. But this has a fantastic built-in antenna tuner that works really, really well. It also has a built-in SWR sweep function that allows you to sweep your antenna and understand where its resonant points are and if you need to make modifications to your antenna. It is a very, very popular radio. Tons of people have it, tons of YouTube videos on this radio, tons of community support. Also, you have vendor support, but I always like to turn to the community for support just in the event that my thing is not broken and I'm having a problem using it because maybe I didn't read the manual. Some of the cons I put in here is 20 watts. Now, some people might consider that a pro because radios in this price point typically don't have 20 watts. 20 watts is fine in today's world with the solar cycle being as good as it is. And even prior to the solar cycles when I had mine and this current solar cycle, I should say, and I made a lot of great contacts at 20 watts. 20 watts is pretty good, but it's not a 100-watt radio. And a lot of folks say that your first HF radio should be a 100-watt radio. In today's world, with the solar cycle being what it is, at $425, I've got zero problem recommending a 20-watt radio. It does not have a sound card. You might say, well, Ape, why is that a problem? A lot of amateur radio users, when they first get in, want to use digital modes or like to enjoy digital modes or enjoy using these digital modes. Digital modes require you to have a modulated signal, or a digitized signal, I should say, between your radio and your computer. And you do a lot of your interfacing with the radio on your computer. And the fact that this radio doesn't have a sound card means that you need an intermediary sound card between your computer and your radio. That's achievable. DigiRig is a company. I'll just throw the name out there. You can pick up a really nice configuration kit to go from your radio to your computer from DigiRig for about $100. It has a small screen. I talked about that. These things are heavy. I think mine was around 9 pounds. It's no joke if you're going to throw it in a backpack and carry it any distance. They do get hot, so many times a manufacturer, or reseller, I should say, will bundle these with a fan attachment that you can connect to it to keep it cool. I never really had problems with mine heating up, but I didn't use it for really long periods of time. I didn't use it in direct sunlight. I always used it in shade or with a cover on top of it. But them getting hot is something to be considered or mindful of. And the last thing I was going to mention as a con is the firmware update process. When these radios first came out, they were releasing firmware for them all the time, working the bugs and the kinks out. The process is somewhat complicated, uses some older antiquated software, and has to be done twice. This radio does have a detachable faceplate, so you have to update the faceplate or the head of the radio, and then you have to update the body of the radio. But that said, and all those things aside, it is a really nice radio for getting started or into the hobby. And then when you outgrow this radio or don't want it any longer, there's tons of people who would pay you a fair price for it. So like when I got rid of mine, I traded for a pretty nice mobile radio with a buddy because it fit the need that he had at the time. And I missed the radio, but I was able to get rid of it. But I think that's really going to wrap up this video. I'd like to thank everybody for watching. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or recommendations, go ahead and post them below, and I'll do my best to respond. Thanks for watching, everybody. It's much appreciated.